But, one thing that's really interesting working in the space is that if you look at the Chinese government's policy documents, and work your way back, it's really striking in that they tell you exactly what they're going to do. And then 5 years later, they tell you how they've done it. And they tell you what they're going to do next. And then 5 years later, then they come back and visit the thing again.
Because one of the things that we're seeing in a moment of growing multipolarity are these countries like India, like Brazil, and so on, being very independent. Like Turkey is another example, being very independent and kind of trying to as much as they engage with groups like BRICS, for example, at the same time they're holding both superpowers at arm's length. So all of these kind of global south powers are tricky and very hesitant to join anything, I think.
So if you look at the contractors, the manufacturing capabilities of China, I don't think anybody believes that the Chinese contractors will overnight, abandon infrastructure. It is what they do best, right? So I think that will continue to be part of the business. But I think what the government is trying to encourage people to do is to think beyond just building roads and bridges.
In many respects, China is to blame for some of the misunderstandings about the BRI, in part because it doesn't really articulate it. That small is beautiful policy document that he talked about, I'm thinking to myself, how come we didn't know about that?
As China slows in terms of annual GDP growth, I think many companies are finding it increasingly makes sense to go overseas and seek higher growth. Africa is certainly part of that equation. I think Southeast Asia, with a lot more sort of growing population. I think, of course, you see that in Latin America, you see some of that in India.
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden, from the beautiful city of Cape Town, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, you and I have been doing this show now for going on 15 years. Next year will be our 15th year. We're getting close to we're up to almost 1,000 episodes, which is really remarkable. And so in all of the time that we've been doing this show, more and more, there are fewer things that surprise me. A lot of the events that happened in this space, if you watch it carefully enough, you kind of figure what's going to happen around the corner. But the past 2 weeks of what's gone down between China and Brazil, I have to tell you, is completely blown me away. So I did not expect this at all. So for much of the past, I'd say going back a year now, we've heard that negotiations are underway between China and Brazil for Brazil to join the Belt and Road Initiative. This is something that Brazil has passed on for a number of times. And President Lula of Brazil has just balked on it for a number of different reasons. But Xi Jinping is going to be going to Brazil for the G20 summit later this month. There was a lot of anticipation that he was going to announce, Brazil's accession to the Belt and Road. And that was it. Now, let me just play a few sound bites, Cobus, and I want you to give me your take on this, because just 2 weeks ago, at the Bloomberg New Economy at B20 in Sao Paulo, Brazil event, Agriculture and Livestock Minister Carlos Favaro, he made it very clear that the BRI was still on the table.
Brazil doesn't need to fight against anyone. We have a good relationship with the United States, with the European Union. Some protection measures that are imposed on us, they have to be fought against by expanding the number of trade partners that we have. That's the role of BRICS. We act with responsibility. Brazil took measures because there'll be new BRIC countries. But that would come in the way of a harmonious relation. Strengthening the relationship with the BRIC countries, with Asia, the Middle East, and especially with China, that that's an opportunity to overcome the trade barriers that have been imposed on us, because it has affected our competitiveness. We have money, there are people who are willing to consume from us, and I am favorable that Brazil abides by the Silk Route.
The Silk Route, of course, is the Belt and Road Initiative that he was talking about, and those trade protectionist measures he was referring to is the discussion about Donald Trump and the potential incoming administration. Now, by the time we're recording this right before the election, we don't know who's going to win the election, but if Donald Trump, in fact, does become president, he's going to hike tariffs, so he says, on all imports. And in fact, Brazil had seen joining the BRI potentially as a way to hedge some of the risk that comes with a more protectionist United States. Then the following week, just last week, in fact, again, this is head spinning here, we get word from O Globo newspaper, and O Globo newspaper is basically the newspaper of record in Brazil, that Celso Amorim, who's a special presidential advisor for international affairs for the Brazilian government, announced that Brazil will not be joining the Belt and Road Initiative. And let me read you, Cobus, what he said. He said, take the relationship with China to a new level without having to sign an accession contract. We are not entering into a treaty, Amorim said, explaining that Brazil does not want to take Chinese infrastructure and trade projects as a, quote, insurance policy. So there's a little bit of that reference to the U.S. there. The Chinese call it the Belt and Road, and they can give whatever names they want, but what matters most is that there are projects that Brazil has defined as a priority and that may or may not be accepted by Beijing. So a very different tone coming from the administration. And again, this was a little head spinning. Now, all of this kind of comes in the context of the great power competition. And a lot of people in China said that the United States is behind Brazil's decision to change its mind. And they point to some comments by U.S. Trade Representative Catherine Tai, who also spoke at the Bloomberg New Economy Summit that we heard from Favaro. Let's take a listen to what got the Chinese so upset.
The Brazilian government is considering, we believe quite seriously, joining the Belt and Road Initiative. How would you feel about that?
It's a decision for the Brazilian government, so I want to be upfront about that. That said, I would encourage our friends in Brazil to look at the risks in today's economy through a lens like the ones that we are using, through an objectivity lens, through a risk management lens, and to really think about what the best pathway is forward for more resilience in the Brazilian economy and in the world economy.
Now, in the context of the U.S.-China relationship and Tai's previous comments about China, that seems rather benign, I would say, but boy, oh boy, that really pissed off the Chinese. The Chinese embassy in Brasilia just a couple of days later fired back, calling Tai's comments, quote, irresponsible, disrespectful, and saying Brazil's sovereignty in choosing its trading partners, quote, should be respected. Cobus, we have been zigzagging all over on this issue. You covered it last week when it first broke. What's your reaction to what's been going on?
Well, listening to all of these comments again, I was struck by how much seemed to still be left under the surface, and not kind of like fully talked about. Because in the first place, like from Amorim's comments, it's difficult to say exactly what kind of treaty/accession contract, which part of kind of that becoming a BRI kind of country, kind of falls under that particular language. So that's interesting to me. Like Tai's comments also seem to me, there was a little bit of an aspect of like, oh, this cute little shop, kind of pity if something happened to it, kind of like a little bit to that as well. Almost nothing was said on the surface, but many things were kind of implied underneath. So overall, it seems to me to show how the idea of some kind of unified global South coalition, kind of falling under China's wing is a fiction. Because one of the things that we're seeing in a moment of growing multipolarity are these countries like India, like Brazil, and so on, being very independent. Like Turkey is another example, being very independent and kind of trying to as much as they engage with groups like BRICS, for example, at the same time they're holding both superpowers at arm's length. So all of these kind of global South powers are tricky and very hesitant to join anything, I think.
A few points here. It's really important to note that the BRI is not a trade relationship. And so there are constituencies within the Brazilian government and Brazilian society that are very, very nervous about the surging production of Chinese products that are coming in. And Brazil has been among the leaders in developing countries to impose tariffs on imported Chinese products, most notably cars. There is an escalator of tariffs on Chinese EVs that began this year, and that's going to keep going up. There's also movement on steel products and low-cost Chinese imports. So there might be some ambivalence domestically that Lula has to take into account with that. But also there's ambivalence about becoming too reliant on China as a trading partner for beef. I think, remember we talked to Igor Patrick from the South China Morning Post a while ago, and he said that somewhere around 80% of Brazilian beef exports are going to China, which again makes some people a little bit nervous. And then the infrastructure piece of all of this may have come under U.S. pressure, and that was something that Amorim discussed as well. One little footnote of all this, Cobus, and I'd be interested to hear your take. All week, I've been looking for a reaction in China, news reaction, social media reaction, anything that points to, well, Brazil now joined India as another country that rejected the Belt and Road. Not one mention, nothing that I could find. I typed in Basi Iluidai, which is Brazil, Belt and Road. Nothing comes up. Not a single mention of it anywhere. No comment, no official media, no Global Times, no Guancha or Observer.com, which is typically very forward on international affairs. It has been scrubbed or it never appeared. I just think that's interesting because it also reveals, Cobus, that people in China don't really see what's happening here on the story like this. And it shows that this is how some of these narratives get highly distorted when the fact is that they don't have access to the same information that the rest of the world has.
Yes, absolutely. And also in lots of ways, it's true in the other direction as well. Within the US, I think it has its own kind of polarity that shapes its own kind of media reality. I think from both sides of that superpower divide, like there's very little of the world visible, I think, when you're in the center of those kind of power structures, I think.
Well, we thought it would be an interesting time to have a discussion about the state of the Belt and Road. And it's something that we've been talking about all year, especially coming out of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation and Lending to Africa, which has been the focus of our Africa show that we do every Friday. And so we wanted to check back in with somebody on the ground who knows what's going on because he's actually negotiating the deals. Some of you may recall several years ago, we interviewed Lui Kanyi, who's a project finance lawyer based in Beijing and head of China at a major international law firm. He has these insights that come from somebody who's, again, actually doing the work on project finance for Belt and Road projects. He has been studying everything that comes out of the Chinese leadership, out of these conferences like FOCAC and elsewhere, to understand the key trends. And we had a chance to speak with him before all of this Brazil stuff went down, so we didn't have the chance to talk to him specifically about Brazil, but we did ask him about the pulse of the Belt and Road today as it enters into its second decade. Let's take a listen to our conversation with Lui Kanyi. Lui Kanyi, thank you so much for joining us again. It's been a while since we've had a chance to speak with you, and we're really eager to catch up and to get your sense of what's happening on the ground in Beijing as you talk with your clients and you hear the buzz. And so wonderful to have you again on the program from Beijing.
Thank you, Eric. And thank you, Cobus. It's great to be back. Thank you for having me.
So let's just kind of get into it. We're about a month out from the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. There was a lot of talk about the $51 billion announcement that came at the end of it. It was a financial pledge. We dived into that quite a bit in our extensive coverage of FOCAC. Last year, we saw at the Belt and Road Forum $100 billion that was put out. There's a lot of confusion outside of China as to whether or not the old China Belt and Road is still intact, because we see these big numbers. We've also heard a lot about Xiao'ermei, which is small is beautiful. And at the same time, we are also hearing all of these headlines about how the Chinese economy is facing its most difficult challenges in a generation, as evidenced by the new stimulus that's come out and the efforts of the central government to try and jumpstart growth. Help us understand the moment that we're in from your ground level perspective in terms of the BRI and where it stands right now.
Wow, Eric, that's a pretty big question. So I'll see what I can do. So I think working my way back from the question. So first on the economy, I think for many people here on the ground in China, I think one of the really interesting things I've observed is that for many of the younger generation, this is the first time in their lives that they've ever experienced a slowdown, right? So I think for many, many people that we see working now, they've only ever known growth at 10%, 8%, 6%. And they've never really seen growth at the levels that we're seeing now, which is 5%. Right. So I think this is something that many people have felt uncomfortable with. If we were having this conversation a couple months ago, I would have said, I think people are somewhat worried. I think the mood now with the newly announced stimulus and how the stock market and generally the market has behaved, I think you're seeing a lot more uncertainty, but also quite a bit of optimism. So where that goes, it really depends. So I think that's the first part of your question. On the second part, on the BRI and where things are going, I think the last time we spoke was it 2 years ago? And I think going back further, one of the reasons I think, it is really an interesting time to be here working in the market right now, especially as a practitioner on the BRI. I think a lot of people ask me, what's happening to BRI? Is it still there? I think if you go back 10 years, and I think this is the 11th year of the BRI now. And I think one of the reasons why people will ask that question is because for a very long time, people have assumed that the BRI meant infrastructure, right? So, and I think for many, many years, that was true. For the first, certainly 7 to 10 years, first decade, if I could call it that, I think there is certainly an observation that huge infrastructure projects dominated the BRI. But, one thing that's really interesting working in this space is that if you look at the Chinese government's policy documents, and work your way back, it's really striking in that they tell you exactly what they're going to do. And then 5 years later, they tell you how they've done it. And they tell you what they're going to do next. And then 5 years later, then they come back and visit the thing again. So looking back at the original BRI announcement, in fact, you'll notice, I think many people will now realize it's never about infrastructure per se. I think they made it very clear that BRI is about connectivity, right? So how do you do connectivity? Well, you need to be able to transport things across borders. You need to have roads, you need to have power, and then you can start trading and exchanging ideas and culture and so on. So I think that was why the first decade of the BRI saw mostly power infrastructure projects. You needed that to get to the next stage. And I think, as you mentioned, I think the buzzword or the keyword now is as BRI heads into its second decade, 小而美, so small and beautiful, is now the key term. I think this was first coined a couple years back. And the idea is that once you have the basic infrastructure in place, then you need to move on. You don't build roads and bridges and ports for the sake of it, as some early critics of the BRI claims. I think now it's pretty clear that in many countries, while there are, projects coming in different shapes and sizes, and there are always debates on whether some projects are more appropriate than others, but on the whole, you'll see that projects are being put into use, and they're starting to lead to further investments. So coming back to the last part of your question, now what's been happening on the BRI? So what's really, really interesting over the last few years, certainly since the pandemic, is the accelerated pace at which offshoring has had an impact, the nature of investments on the BRI. So I think, Eric, you're based in Vietnam, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So I think Vietnam and certainly Mexico has been two of the main recipients of offshoring. As America moves to increase tariffs and Europe increased tariffs, that has led to Chinese companies looking to go out, quote unquote. Going out used to be the phrase in the early 2000s. I think now the correct term is go offshore. And then they look to set up factories and manufacturing sites in countries like Vietnam and Mexico as a way to deal with the growing trade barriers that's being put up. So I think that's been a really interesting development. I think for Vietnam in particular, I was in Hanoi last year as part of the trip to see the China-Laos Railway open. And, when I was in Hanoi, there was so much investment. The locals told me that there's been so much investment in such a short span of time that you're now experiencing brownouts. I don't know. Eric, are you in Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh?
No, I'm in Saigon, but we're feeling the strain of the infrastructure here. We do have not regular brownouts, but, enough that you're like, oh, here we are again. But again, it comes back to this problem of infrastructure. And this is something Cobus and I talk about all the time. And I guess I want to pick up on one point. And Cobus, I'd love to get your take on this because you think a lot about this in the context of Africa. You said that the first wave of the BRI was the basic infrastructure, but yet you look at a continent like Africa, and I know you have some of clients who do work in Africa, and yet there's still a $150 billion infrastructure deficit on much of that in basic infrastructure, roads, rail, ports, and that logistics. China no longer is in that space anymore. Is that because of the debt sustainability issues or because there is a belief in Beijing that we don't need to produce that type of infrastructure because it's already been done in the first phase of the BRI?
So look, I think this is a personal take, right? So it's a bit of all of the above. And I think the pandemic had a bit to do with that as well, because what it did was it reduced the ability for people to actually look at projects. Large projects, especially huge sort of infrastructure projects, they take time to cook, right? So, it's not like, you say, I want a bridge and it gets built in a year. It takes a lot of time to plan, to design, to get through the permits, and then it takes time to build, and then it gets time to finalize the construction and get it working. So I think the pandemic certainly has something to do with that. I think that sustainability issue is there. It certainly has kept many people, including ourselves, busy for the last few years. And I think one of the difficulty there is, of course, while infrastructure gaps exist, I think for any given country, just like any person, the ability to invest and pay back that investment is limited at any given point in time. So I think you always have to pick and choose your battles. Right. So I think for China, what's been really interesting is that for the first decade of the BRI, and in fact, a little before that, what you see in terms of infrastructure energy investment is generally done on a somewhat quasi-coordinated basis. So I think there are some critics which will say, China is a monolithic whole. China's doing this, China's doing that. But if you're on the ground, you see different banks and different contractors trying to go after projects and finance projects and get it built. And of course, there is some discussion, between these players, but not really in a very coordinated fashion. So I think as we head into the second decade, I think there is going to be a bit more coordination going forward, which will help with. But I think what we're seeing now, and especially with some of the restructurings that you're no doubt seeing, is a process where some of the projects that were done before in the first decade needs to be sorted out. Right? So I think as that works its way through the system, then I think investment will come back. So I think coming back to the bigger question, which is, you mentioned, well, is China going to be out of that space? I don't think so. Right. So if you look at the contractors, the manufacturing capabilities of China, I don't think anybody believes that the Chinese contractors will overnight, abandon infrastructure. It is what they do best. Right. So I think that will continue to be part of the business. But I think what the government is trying to encourage people to do is to think beyond just building roads and bridges. You need to have a goal, you need to have a strategy to then capitalize on your capital investment. Cobus?
Well, kind of that issue, I'd love to hear more about that, because that issue has been one of the biggest problems, I think, in the African infrastructure space, is that sometimes the governments are really pushing the project itself, but they're not necessarily so well integrated into regional plans. The long-term economic sustainability is not necessarily thought through, or the profitability plan is not necessarily in place. Kanyi, as you've been pointing out, this has been a long-term problem, I think, in the African side, and I think for some other large-scale infrastructure projects too. So just following up on your point, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how the Chinese government is pushing these governments to think through these issues. Are they actually putting out some guidelines, or is that more happening at the kind of contractor and financer level?
So first, I think in terms of the feasibility phase of any project, I think that has to come from the local planning, the governance, regulators, right? So the local government has to play a key role in that. I don't think anybody will claim that they will have a better view of what the local population requires than those who are actually living the life locally. I think for expecting that from a Chinese contractor or a bank, I think it's probably not, in my view, probably the first protocol, right? So I think whoever is sponsoring or developing that project needs to get it right, first of all. And then, of course, the financiers, the banks will come in and take a look and do a sanity check and see whether, that is in fact something they agree with. Coming to your second part of the question, which is, well, what's happening now and what's being done to encourage more thinking? I think we're all waiting to see, if I'm being completely honest, right? So the last couple of years, what's really interesting is that large-scale lending has significantly slowed, since the pandemic. Right. So I think not being able to look at projects, not being able to go and visit and actually sit down and talk about projects has significantly affected people's ability to execute. But also because traditionally, if you look at the first decade of how China financed major infrastructure projects, it's usually done in US dollars. And as we all know, US dollars are expensive right now, which in part has led to the debt issues that's being experienced by some of the African borrowers and as well as other borrowers. So it's not cheap to borrow right now, right? So as a result, we're not currently in a phase where you have a lot of new deals popping off everywhere. Certainly it's not like it was 5-7 years ago. So a lot more attention is being diverted into, one, sorting through some of the legacy debt problems, making sure that the borrowers and the sponsor are able to survive this period and go forward. Second, there's a lot more attention being paid to some of the externalities that's being experienced in the past, sorting out. So as there are anti-corruption drives, government audits going through. I think that's part of that as well. And thirdly, I think based on the new projects that we've been seeing in the market, I think there's a lot more, the approval process is now a lot more stringent. I think there's a lot more testing that goes on within the investors and the banks in terms of whether a project is feasible and how it's formed. And just lastly, a couple of years back, when people started first talking about ESG, I think people were expecting it to be something that was going to be required. But I think few saw how quickly I think it became almost mandatory for the Chinese companies and the banks. It's now almost a feature of the market where ESG is part of the discussion. Whether ESG is the same thing as ESG talked about elsewhere, that's up for discussion. But certainly there's a lot more attention being paid to that and sustainability. So I think that's absolutely a good development.
Well, that's the beautiful part of the small is beautiful, right? ESG is a component of the beautiful part, correct?
Cool.
Yeah. There's a little bit of confusion, I think, on the part of a number of governments in the Global South as to where China is. You've laid out a very compelling case as to why China is no longer financing these large-scale infrastructure projects, in part because dollars are expensive right now. Debt sustainability issues are a key concern. And again, it's just not the same priority in the second decade of the BRI as it was in the first decade of the BRI. That being said, in the run-up to FOCAC, the Kenyans came to Beijing with a huge plan, once again, for the extension of the standard gauge railway from Naivasha to Kisumu. And that is a project that the Chinese have balked on for at least 10 years now. And they came back with a public-private partnership proposal. As far as I know, it fell on deaf ears. The Nigerians came, again, with lots of big railroad proposals that they want to build. We've seen this in other parts of the world as well. Certainly here in Southeast Asia, huge ambitions for rail and for large-scale projects. So I guess my question is that do you find that there's a gap in terms of where a lot of countries think China is and where China is as you've described it, and that China literacy problem that starts to pop up in terms of, do you get the sense that a lot of developing countries and stakeholders in those places fully understand the changes that you've articulated now as to what China's priorities are in terms of their lending for BRI projects?
Yeah, well, China isn't a monolithic whole. So every bank has their different views and everybody I speak to has a different take. So of course, then it's difficult for people who's coming to China and then trying to figure out what's happening. So I think financing using US dollars is difficult. It's expensive and it's not very attractive right now. So I think we know that. Based on what I see, a lot more the more successful new money projects that's taken off in the last 3 years are denominated in RMB. Right? So I think that is one ingredient which makes it easier. I think there is some regulatory or policy push for that, of course. I think for obvious reasons. The difficulty with financing things in RMB, especially a big infrastructure project, is for the local government, your income tend to be in local currencies. And usually there's quite a lot of difficulty in then bridging that gap between the local currency and RMB. So without going through USD. So then you expose yourself to different currency fluctuations. So at the risk of being sort of diving into too much technicality, I think the more successful projects that we've seen tend to have some type of arrangement where it allows themselves some exposure to RMB. I think that will be helpful. Second is, I think for the larger projects, unless it's something that has a very clear support from all sides, where the banks feel comfortable with, then I think many banks right now are still trying to work out what next steps are. Right? So I think it wouldn't be too far off the mark to say, I think as we emerge out of the uncertainties of the pandemic, and then now we've had some time to look around the market and still trying to work out where the world's going in this new age, I think a lot of the banks are being quite cautious, as they should be. So I think it's going to take a little time for them to become comfortable with the larger projects again. And certainly, I think the governments which are trying to get those projects off the ground need to be prepared in presenting a bankable, a convincingly bankable case to the banks so that they're willing to lend.
So just a very, very broad and very basic question. If you look at the big picture at the moment, both Chinese trade and investment are increasingly facing geopolitical constraints. In some of its markets, it concentrated on traditionally, particularly in Europe and the US. And at the same time, there is this strong flow, as you were mentioning, via kind of offshoring to other markets, to global south markets. So I was wondering, in the first place, if you look across the global south, where are you seeing the most kind of action in that respect? Like, where are the patterns emerging where the most investment is happening? But then in the second place, more broadly, how is this making you think differently about globalization itself? All of this commentary coming out of the global north that we're in a moment of deglobalization. But at the same time, we cover investment announcements very regularly in our newsletter, and there's new investment announcements daily from Chinese companies into the global south. So where are we in terms of globalization, kind of as a whole, considering that we're seeing these two contrasts?
No, I think that's a great question, Cobus, and it's something that I've been thinking about for some time now. So if you look at by the way, I'm not an economist, so take it with a grain of salt, right? But, I've been trying to work out a strategy for managing all these difficulties going forward as well. And as part of the research, if you look back at China's development for 30 years, right, you'll see a consistent trend where FDI, foreign direct investment, that is money coming from overseas, investing into China, declining over 30 years. It's a very clear decline. And that graph, if you put it next to annual GDP growth, there's a high degree of correlation. So the annual GDP growth declines as well, from a very high 10% plus to where we're at now. But then if you then look at ODI, which is overseas direct investment, that is money invested by China or Chinese corporates into overseas, then it's a very clear trend of growth. Again, very high correlation. So that got me interested. And so, okay, so we knew that much. So I've always suspected that was the case. And I started looking at the history of other countries, for example, the US, Germany, Japan. And quite surprisingly, I think this trend is something that I think most economies, sort of industrialized economies go through, apparently. And as part of that, of course, what that suggests, that seems to come from a theory I have, which is over the last 20-some years, I think China has gone through 4 stages of development. Right? So I think if you look back to 1999, January 2000, that was when the slogan "going out" was first branding about. So I don't know whether you remember that. Right? So going out, 走出去, right? And then, of course, that first phase was where the Chinese companies, SOEs mostly, started venturing outside of China, right? So they started investing in strategic resources, agriculture, oil, iron sands. A lot of the iron sands projects in Australia were made during that time. A lot of coal, coking coal and all that, right? So all over the place, soybeans, beef, So all that was the first. And then the second stage is what I would call internationalization. So this is where as companies increasingly go overseas and they started to get used to the rules of international trade and some international institutions, and of course, most clearly marked by China's accession to the WTO, right? So these are not distinct phases. So then as China then gets used to international trade and the rules of international trade, then it gradually expands its holdings. The third phase, which I think we saw a couple years back, was localization. So as you started to venture out more, of course, you start to have more employees. You no longer was feasible to ship everything from China, right? So you need to source local goods and workforce. You need to build local ties. I think we saw quite a bit of that in the latter part of the last decade. And then I think we're now on the cusp of globalization. Right. So as Chinese companies now have sizable holdings, I mean, if you look at the EV companies, you look at a lot of the other investments, manufacturings, in Mexico, in Vietnam, beyond Southeast Asia, Central Asia, now you're in a phase where a lot of the Chinese companies have significant workforce and assets overseas, and they have to globalize. They have to find a way to manage that effectively and to manage the growth and compliance issues and so on, right? And then if you look at the other countries, it's nothing that they haven't gone through. It's just that they develop at different paces. So I think we're in a stage where as Europe and the US are then post-globalization, let's just call it that, in that phase, whereas China is just starting to globalize. Then of course, there's some mismatch. And it's natural given the different development cycles that we're experiencing.
But in contrast to those other countries that globalized, China's globalizing now in a very complex geopolitical landscape, which is making it increasingly difficult for them to set up factories in the world's most lucrative markets in Europe, the United States, Japan, even in Mexico, where they would try to take advantage of the free trade agreement between Mexico and the United States, but clearly setting up auto factories in Mexico to export into the United States is going to be problematic. I guess I'm curious then, when in the discussions with your clients about diversifying their ODI, moving manufacturing to other countries like here in Vietnam, how much of it is done in response to the increasingly acrimonious relationship with the United States and Europe, whereby they are trying to move manufacturing out of China in order to evade sanctions and to accommodate to the new geopolitical realities that are making life much more difficult for Chinese companies than it was even 10 years ago?
I think that's certainly a large consideration, but from my own experience, I don't think that's the only consideration, like many other things, right? So I think China is such a big place. People and clients and businesses that want to go overseas come in all different flavors. So I have came across people who's range from highly, highly sophisticated companies, SOEs or otherwise, who's a lot of experience going overseas. And they do things in a very strategic way. They go overseas because they see the regulatory issues, they see the geopolitical tensions, they want to internationalize and then localize, to make sure the brand can grow in a way that minimizes the effect of the potential geopolitical competition, right? So there's quite a few of that, certainly. And then, of course, on the other extreme, we have people who actually literally will come to me and go, "Oh, Kanyi, I feel like we have to go overseas." And I ask them, why? I said, well, because it's too competitive in China. We just have to see better growth elsewhere. So I get that. Where do you want to go? And they tell me, well, I was hoping you can tell me, right? So, well, my response to that is if you're asking a lawyer that question, then maybe you should be thinking that again. So I think part of the issue is as China slows, in terms of annual GDP growth, I think many companies are finding it increasingly makes sense to go overseas and seek higher growth. Africa is certainly part of that equation. I think Southeast Asia, with a lot more sort of growing population. I think, of course, you see that in Latin America, you see some of that in India. So I think that is part of that, right? So just to round out the discussion, if you were to look back 10 years at the very early days, companies which went overseas at that point were actually probably the first movers, so who wanted to go overseas, want to set up shop, wanted to localize, because they're actually moving resources from a highly growing China market to an overseas market that's not growing as quickly as China at that time. That's not the case here, right? So right now, the companies are actually looking for growth overseas because they feel like that's where it makes the most sense.
So we're in this transition phase now from the first BRI, which was again focused on large-scale infrastructure, to now the second iteration of the BRI, which is the small is beautiful, focusing on connectivity. ESG is a big part of it as well, as we talked about earlier, taking into account feasibility studies and debt sustainability issues, all kind of wrapped up. Now, when clients come to you and say, Kanyi, I'm trying to figure out what is the BRI today, where is it going? What do you tell them in terms of the next, say, 1 to 2 years of what people should be focusing on? Because again, small is beautiful is still pretty vague and ambiguous as to what it is. How do you provide people some meat on the bones, as they say in the US, or just some precision as to what this thing is and where they should be looking in terms of better understanding the BRI going forward?
So actually, there's a policy document which says exactly what small and beautiful is. The name eludes me right now, but after this, I'll send it to you. So of course, it is phrased in such a way that's inclusive. So it's not limited to just a certain things. But what the second phase of the BRI, quote unquote, this is not an official term, is about, it's not about connectivity. The BRI as a whole is about connectivity. Right. So the second phase, small and beautiful, is one part of it. It is certainly a focus. Based on my recollection of that policy document, says small and beautiful things such as focusing on sustainability, on energy transition, on agriculture. On the whole, I think what that means is small and beautiful is intended to refer to projects which are smaller than the traditional infrastructure/energy projects, but benefits the local population more. Okay, so things like, as I mentioned, agriculture, manufacturing capabilities, productive assets, things like working together with local banks to fund local businesses. I think those will all be part of a small and beautiful focus. And that, in fact, those are mentioned in the policy document. So I think the idea is that now, once you've got the basic in place, you've got lights on, you've got power, you've got roads to transport your goods, now is the time to make sure that investments are channeled towards local businesses and to improve the livelihoods of the cities and the communities touched by the BRI. So I think if you think along those lines, I think it gives you a fairly good idea on where things might be going. And one of the major pushes in terms of offshoring, which you mentioned earlier, is part of this, right? So as you set up manufacturing or factory bases, you hire local people. And let's face it, there's no way you'll be able to truck in people from China where it's just far too expensive now. Never mind that people don't want to move anymore. I think that builds the ties and improves the living standards locally. I think that's what this is aimed at.
And connecting to that, is the larger logic then that eventually all of this will translate into new markets for Chinese companies and new possible kind of like areas for Chinese investment? Is there a kind of a one-to-one logic in that way, or is it still kind of framed in terms of these countries developing on their own is itself a kind of a global public good?
Well, I think if you look back to probably 20 years ago, I think there was a phase in China's development where everything's about exports, everything's about generating foreign currency reserves. I think what we're seeing now is a gradual change from that, right? So over the last decade or so, I think things have increasingly moved away from that model. I think where this will lead to, and this is my guess, of course, is that Chinese companies will find local production center that will be able to produce goods more efficiently and lower prices for overseas markets, and thereby share the wealth as part of that process, similarly as the Americans did and the Japanese did back in the days when they went through a similar cycle. And also, I think China is also moving towards a model where it's increasingly going to open up its market for imports, right? So I think as goods produced overseas become attractive and and are increasingly imported into China, I think that's going to improve the connectivity as well. So we're moving from a purely export-driven model to a model where it's hybrid.
Kanyi, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing some of your insights on where we are with the BRI. It's obviously changing very quickly. And we have to make sure that it's not 2 years again before we have you back on, because this thing needs to be updated every 6 to 9 months so we can all kind of keep on top of what's happening here. So Lui Kanyi is a project finance lawyer based in Beijing and head of China at an international law firm in the capital. And as you've been hearing, one of the smartest guys out there when it comes to understanding project finance and the Belt and Road. Kanyi, once again, thank you for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to join us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Cobus, talking with somebody like Kanyi, who is in the trenches doing the deals for the BRI, doing these project finance deals, is such an odd experience, because when you sit outside of China and you consume all of the media narratives, not just from the West, but from other parts of the world as well, you get such a different view of it. His pragmatism, it's this, but it's also that. Oh, and by the way, it's this too, and it's that. Just runs completely counter to the binary narratives that we hear about the BRI. Again, we've heard about debt traps. We've heard about it. That's a military plan to take over the world and all these other things. And it's often quite reductive in terms of understanding what the BRI is. And in many respects, China is to blame for some of the misunderstandings about the BRI, in part because it doesn't really articulate it. You know, that small is beautiful policy document that he talked about, I'm thinking to myself, how come we didn't know about that? I didn't know about it. And okay, I'm not necessarily the expert on all things BRI, but you and I look at this much more closely than the average person, and if it didn't come across our radars, the outreach on that was suffering in many respects. And I think this is part of the problem that the Chinese have in communicating what the BRI is and what it's not, is that, well, we don't really know. And so it's really refreshing to be able to hear, again, this more nuanced perspective from someone like Kanyi.
Absolutely. And I think it also shows that in a lot of ways, I think the BRI is something unprecedented. Like, we haven't seen this kind of singular international outreach program really from anyone. The closest analogy is something like the Marshall Plan, but I mean, that was much more targeted. So,
yeah. So very different context too, of course.
Yeah, it's very rare to see this global kind of roll out of a million different programs, all somehow magically also connected. So in that sense, it's a communication challenge, but then its level of complexity, I think, makes it a general kind of conceptual challenge as well.
It's such an experience to be able to look at the BRI from here in Southeast Asia and from where your vantage point in Africa, because here in Southeast Asia, they're still talking about the huge mega projects that they used to build in Africa, the Standard Gauge Railway, the Kaduna Railway in Nigeria. We can pick our various port projects, but they're not doing that anymore in Africa. They are going to continue to do it here in Southeast Asia on the large scale. We're talking multi-billion-dollar projects, which I haven't seen many announcements of those.
Yeah, but I wouldn't necessarily kind of count those out in Africa. I mean, I tend to guess that there'll be a different time scale for that. But I mean, FOCAC still saw some announcements of some projects.
We saw a couple big announcements, but they felt like MOUs and they didn't feel like contracts. Particularly in Nigeria, there was something for a $3.3 billion park, which I don't know, that felt a little bit sketchy to me in terms of the details. But I guess my point is that unless the feasibility studies, and that's something that Kanyi talked about, are just rock solid on a return on investment and a path to profitability, it's going to be very difficult to do that. One of the advantages here in Southeast Asia is you have a density of population and of industry that can make these projects much more feasible, much more profitable faster. And I think that might be one of the challenges that you're going to face in other parts of the world that lack that population density that we have here in Asia.
Yeah, I mean, Africa does have population density in some regions. I guess the issue is also that I think Africa is making its way from one very particular kind of structural position in the global economy to a more normalized position. And the highlighting of the need for sustainability and profitability projections is kind of part of that evolution is, kind of to my mind. Like, I think Africa was so stuck in an aid space for so long that the logic of of a project needing to show very narrow and immediate profitability, that logic itself took some time, I think, to establish, because it was, it wasn't the logic that was driving aid-related projects before. So in that sense, I think Africa is kind of making its way there. I think what is also, obviously, it's also just less rich than a place like Southeast Asia, which means that, that the path to profitability is also trickier. But it is, as you said, it's very interesting to see at full speed in Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and there's also that geopolitical setting as well, that Southeast Asia and Central Asia are more important strategically for China than, say, South America and even the Middle East. When we talk to our friends who are in the Middle East scholarship space, they will remind us that the Middle East is not as high a geopolitical priority anywhere near as much as the near abroad here in Southeast Asia as well. So this is not something that's unique to just to Africa. I mean, we saw the numbers in South America, and they were pretty modest. It was talking about $500 million of lending. That, remember, we saw that from the Boston University Global Development Policy Center and the Inter-American Dialogue that showed an uptick in lending to $500 million, but that's relatively modest for a region as large as South America. So again, I don't want to come off as saying I think that Africa is unique in that respect, but I still come back to this question of the infrastructure deficits and the gaping need for infrastructure in these parts of the world and the lack of financing for it. Now, Tanzania may be one country to watch in terms of how they've been able to finance their standard gauge railway without taking on massive sovereign loans and sovereign debt. Still too early to tell if it's been successful, but it could be a model to look at, where they borrowed from the private markets, they negotiated a whole bunch of different deals to form a patchwork of financing that put together their standard gauge railway, from what I understand, at a fraction of the cost of what the Kenyans paid to China for theirs. So there might be some interesting models that emerge out of this era that we're in that pave the way for large-scale infrastructure to be built using a very different formula.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see, whether all of these infrastructure projects purported supposed to stop Chinese influence in Africa, or curb it at least, coming from G7 countries, whether those will significantly change the landscape, both in terms of funding models and just simply in terms of, kind of competition in the space for China. I mean, so far we haven't really seen that. It's probably too early to say, but it'll be interesting to see whether that actually happens.
Well, the competition would imply that there's scarcity, and because of the infrastructure deficit in Africa being what it is, somewhere between $100 to $150 billion a year, if you go based on what the African Development Bank puts it at, feels like to me they're not going to bump into each other. There are more than enough projects out there that all participants can partake in without actually being in that binary competitive mindset. So I would be surprised if there's any kind of offset because of PGI, which is the US initiative, or Global Gateway, which is the European initiative, doing projects that's going to somehow be seen as somehow displacing the Chinese, when in fact there's just plenty of other projects that can be built. It just feels the need is too big.
But I mean more whether they will set out new funding models, new paradigms of how to build infrastructure or not, or whether, whether they will change the thinking about what infrastructure provision in Africa will look like.
Well, they say, I mean, this has been the part of both Global Gateway and the PGI, is that they're going to leverage they have this line, I forget what it is, but it's basically leveraging private capital. And we've heard so much about this magical pool of private capital that's out there, that, and they have this line which says if only like 5% of, this pension fund invested in Africa, that could close the gap right there. Well, that pension fund doesn't want to invest in Africa, because if it did, it would have done it by now. And so I think the promises coming out of the US and Europe to use private capital is wishful thinking, because private capital doesn't always need the governments in the US and Europe to move. They can move on their own. There's nothing stopping them, as we've seen with other companies operating in Africa. And so I'm a little bit skeptical that we're going to see a flood of private capital coming in. It will be interesting to see if the U.S. and what they're doing in the Lobito corridor can pioneer a model that doesn't rely on sovereign lending. And that is, again, adding to the debt burden in these countries. I still haven't figured out how they're going to do it. You hear about these big fanciful numbers like $300 billion for Global Gateway, and how does that get passed through the system without turning into debt? I'm sure they've got some very good answers to it. It's just not immediately evident to me how that works.
Yeah, I mean, we also know that there is a lot of Western private capital flowing to Africa, but mostly in the form of oil and gas projects.
Or Eurobond, which comes at a very pretty much high interest rate there with pretty tough repayment terms.
Yes, so in both cases, kind of Africa, again, is in a structural position of just being a site of extraction. There's no value addition in either fossil fuels or in Eurobond lending in that sense, So in that sense, I think, kind of the BRI still is something really unique and something really different in the sense that it does challenge, I think, some of these kind of assumptions about Africa and other global South markets. And to a certain extent, maybe that's one of the reasons why the Eurobond is the wrong word. This is one of the reasons why the BRI remains so difficult to understand, I think, for Western, stakeholders, because it so fundamentally challenges the way that they think about the global South.
Yeah, but it's not just Western stakeholders. Again, you and I have talked to any number of folks in developing countries that don't have a solid command of what this thing is because it's difficult to figure out. I mean, I learned so much just listening to Kanyi today that I wish that he would package up what he said, maybe get ChatGPT to make an online course out of it and then push it down the line to better educate people about what's happening. And that is such a desperate need out there, again, to close these literacy gaps, to understand what the trends are so that when a country like Nigeria goes to Beijing with huge proposals, they are bringing these proposals that are firmly in line with where Chinese lenders, corporates, and other investors are thinking. And that's, I think, something missing in the marketplace right now, is this knowledge space. I mean, there's a really big opportunity to educate people on all this stuff.
I mean, I agree. I'm not sure that ChatGPT is going to get us there, though.
No, I don't think so.
There might be a few hallucinations kind of worked in there, but...
Fair enough. Let's leave our conversation there. This is the kind of work that we're doing every single day, and we're very thrilled that Kanyi is among our subscribers, and we appreciate his support, and he's been a very big supporter of CGSP over the years. If you'd like to join people like Kanyi and governments around the world, NGOs, scholars who follow the work we do every day, it's very easy. Just go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Subscriptions start at just $19 a month. And if you are a student or teacher, of course, you can email me, Eric, at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you the links for half off, just $10. And I was just in Taipei a couple of weeks ago, and my Starbucks run was $10 every day. So I figure if you can afford a Starbucks run, then you can afford a subscription to us. We feel that it's a good value, better in fact than a Starbucks run. So even a student and a teacher, I think, can swing it, and we'd love to have more in our reader community. So again, we also want to thank all of our Patreon supporters as well. The link is in the show notes if you would like to join our community on Patreon, and we do appreciate everything that they do to help make this work possible. So Cobus and I will be back again next week. For Cobus van Staden in Cape Town, I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City. We'll be back again with another edition of the China Global South podcast. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.